My 7-year-old granddaughter wouldn't let go of my hand when I tried to walk her back to her mother's car. It was the 4th of July. We'd spent the afternoon at my place in Flagstaff. Hot dogs on the grill, sparklers in the backyard, the whole thing. My daughter Renata had driven up from Phoenix with little Sophie and her husband Garrett. Everything looked fine from the outside. Everything always looked fine with Garrett. But Sophie wouldn't let go of my hand. "Grandpa Roy," she said, her voice so small I almost missed it under the noise of neighbors setting off fireworks down the street. "Do I have to go?" I looked down at her. She was still in her little red, white, and blue outfit, her hair coming loose from the braid Renata had done that morning. And her eyes, God, her eyes had something in them I didn't have the right word for back then. I do now. It was dread. "Of course you do, sweetheart," I said, "because what else do you say? Mommy's right there. You'll be home in your own bed tonight." She nodded and let go. I watched the car pull out of the driveway. I stood there longer than I needed to. Something sat heavy in my chest all evening, the kind of feeling you can't name but can't shake either. I told myself it was nothing. She'd been tired, overstimulated from the day. Kids say things. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I was wrong, and that guilt has lived in me every day since. I'm Roy Callahan. I'm 61 years old, retired from 28 years as a structural engineer for the state of Arizona. I've been a widower since my wife Carol passed from ovarian cancer 11 years ago. I have one daughter, Renata, who is 34. And I have Sophie, who just turned 9, and who calls me Grandpa Roy, even though I've told her she can just say Grandpa if she wants. She says Roy makes me sound more like a real person. That's the kind of kid she is. Renata met Garrett Holloway at a work happy hour in Scottsdale about 5 years ago. He was in commercial real estate, good-looking in the way that made you trust him before you decided to, with an easy laugh and a firm handshake for every person in the room. I liked him at first. I want to be honest about that. He made Renata happy, or he made her seem happy, and after years of watching her grind through 2 relationships that left her worse than she started, I was grateful. The wedding was small, backyard ceremony at a friend's ranch outside Sedona, late October when the red rocks glow like something out of a postcard. Sophie was 18 months old by then, Renata's daughter from a previous relationship. Her biological father had been out of the picture since before Sophie was born. Garrett adopted her within the first year of marriage. I remember thinking, this man is stepping up. This is a good thing. I started noticing changes maybe 2 years in. Renata stopped calling as often. When I drove down to Phoenix, visits felt managed, Garrett always nearby, conversations steered towards safe topics. He never said anything wrong exactly. He was too careful for that. But whenever I suggested taking Sophie out alone, just the 2 of us to the Children's Museum or the zoo, Garrett would find a reason. She's been under the weather. She has a birthday party. We actually have plans that afternoon, Roy. Sorry. I mentioned it to my sister Diane once. She said I was probably being a typical overprotective grandfather and that I should give the man some credit. I mostly believed her. But then there was the 4th of July. And then there was the phone call 6 weeks later. It was a Tuesday morning in late August. I was at my kitchen table with coffee and the newspaper. Yes, I still get the physical paper. I'm 61. Leave me alone. When my cell buzzed. Number I didn't recognize. Phoenix area code. Is this Roy Callahan, Sophie's grandfather? Yes. Mr. Callahan, my name is Deborah Walsh. I'm a 3rd grade teacher at Saguaro Elementary in Phoenix. I have Sophie in my class this year. I'm sorry to be calling you directly. I got your number from Sophie herself. She wrote it on a piece of paper and gave it to me this morning and asked me to call you. She said, and I'm reading this exactly. Tell Grandpa Roy that Garrett has a room. The coffee cup stopped halfway to my mouth. She said a room, I repeated. Yes, sir. I've been teaching for 19 years. I know when a child is trying to tell me something without knowing how to say it. I'm calling you because Sophie specifically asked me to. But I also want you to know that I have an obligation to report this to Child Protective Services, and I intend to do that today. She asked me to call you first. I thought you deserved to know. I was in my truck and on I-17 south toward Phoenix within 20 minutes. I called Renata on the way. She didn't answer. I called twice more and left one voicemail that I tried to keep calm, just asking her to call me back, that it was important. I don't know how calm I actually sounded. The drive from Flagstaff to Phoenix is about 2 hours. I spent most of it trying to think clearly and failing. I kept hearing Sophie's voice from the 4th of July, "Do I have to go?" And then Ms. Walsh's voice, "Garrett has a room." A room? What kind of room? Where? What happened there? I knew what kind, I just couldn't let myself think it in full sentences yet. I went to Renata's house first. Garrett's Range Rover wasn't in the driveway. He'd be at his office in Scottsdale until at least 6. Renata answered the door in workout clothes, her face going from surprised to guarded the moment she saw me. "Dad, what are you?" "I need to talk to you," I said, inside. She let me in. The house was immaculate, the way it always was. That particular kind of clean that feels performative, like the point isn't comfort, it's control. I told her about the call from Ms. Walsh. I watched Renata's face while I talked. And what I saw there, it wasn't shock. It was something more complicated than shock. It was the face of a woman who had been waiting for a call like this, and dreading it, and somehow also not letting herself believe it would come. "Renata," I said quietly, "is there a room?" She sat down on the couch and put her face in her hands. "I don't know what it is," she said. Her voice was strange, thin. "He told me it's where he goes to decompress. He worked from home sometimes and he said he needed a private space. It's the room at the end of the basement hallway. He keeps it locked. Have you ever been in it?" Long pause. "He said it's just an office, records, client files. He said it was a liability thing, that he needed to keep confidential documents secure." She looked up at me. "I believed him, Dad. He's my husband. I believed him." "Where is Sophie right now?" "School." "Does she ever go down there, to the basement?" The look on my daughter's face when I asked that question, I'll carry that look for the rest of my life. "He takes her down there sometimes," she said, barely above a whisper. "He says they do puzzles. He says it's their special bonding time." And I thought I wanted to believe. Her voice broke. "She always seems fine when she comes back up. She never said anything. She told her teacher, Renata, she just didn't know how." I'm a structural engineer. I think about load-bearing and failure points. I think about what a structure can hold before it gives way. Sitting in that living room watching my daughter understand what she'd been living inside of, that was a failure I hadn't calculated for. That was a weight neither of us was built to carry. I told her we needed to go to the police. She said she needed a minute. I gave her 5 minutes and then I said we were going. We went. The Phoenix Police Department referred us to a detective specializing in family crimes, a man named Detective Aldridge, quiet and methodical, the kind of man who took notes by hand and made you feel like he was actually listening. We sat in a small interview room and I told him everything Mrs. Walsh had told me, and Renata told him about the locked room and the basement visits. He asked Renata directly, "Has Sophie ever said anything to you that concerned you?" Renata closed her eyes. "She asked me once if rooms could be mean. I thought it was something she saw on TV. Kids say things like that. I should have." "Mrs. Holloway," he said gently, "people in these situations are conditioned not to see it. Your husband's behavior was deliberate. The concealment was deliberate. He told us that given what had been reported, he had grounds to request an emergency welfare check and a warrant application to examine the locked room. He told us to go somewhere, not back to the house, and wait." We waited at a Denny's 3 miles from the police station for 4 hours. I had coffee. I didn't drink. Renata had nothing. She stared at the table most of the time. Once she said, "I'm her mother. How did I not know?" And I didn't have an answer that would help, so I just put my hand over hers and kept it there. Detective Aldridge called at 7:14 p.m. Mr. Callahan, we executed the warrant. I need you to understand that what we found is serious. I can't discuss specifics over the phone, but I want you to know that Sophie is being taken into protective custody tonight as a precaution, and your son-in-law is being detained for questioning. The room, I said. A pause. Yes, sir, the room? I found out later, much later, in court, what was in that room. Soundproofing on the walls. A camera on a mounted bracket in the corner. Zip ties. A small padded mat on the floor. A filing cabinet containing external hard drives meticulously labeled by date. Garrett Holloway had been systematic. He'd kept records the way he kept everything, organized, professional, like a man who intended to never be caught. Sophie had been 3 years old when it started. She was 7 at the time of the 4th of July. 4 years. 4 years, and I'd stood at the end of my driveway and watched the car pull away. The next few weeks were the worst of my life, and I say that having buried a wife. Grief and horror are different shapes of pain. Grief, you know, is coming eventually. Horror hits the parts of you that thought you understood what the world was. Sophie was placed in emergency foster care while the investigation proceeded. Renata was evaluated. The CPS caseworker was careful and thorough, and ultimately the determination was that Renata had no knowledge of the abuse and no culpability. But she wasn't allowed to have unsupervised contact with Sophie immediately, which nearly destroyed her. Garrett retained a defense attorney within hours of his arrest. The lawyer's first move was to claim the room was a secure home office and that the evidence had been mischaracterized. He claimed the camera was for monitoring the basement for security purposes. He claimed the files were encrypted personal records unrelated to any criminal conduct. The forensic team from the Phoenix PD's Digital Crimes Unit worked through those hard drives for 6 weeks. I'm not going to describe what they found. I don't need to. The jury didn't need me to describe it either. The prosecutors had Garrett Holloway's own meticulous documentation. What I will describe is Sophie's forensic interview at the Child Advocacy Center in Phoenix. I wasn't in the room. I sat in a waiting area with Renata and a CPS advocate named Mrs. Okonkwo, who had seen 100 cases like this and somehow still talked about each child like they were the only one that mattered. The interview was conducted by a specialist trained in talking to children, non-leading questions, careful pacing, patient in a way that took years of training to learn. What Sophie told that interviewer formed the core of the prosecution's case. She was 7 years old and she sat in that room and told the truth, every single word. There's a particular kind of bravery that exists in children who have been taught that telling means losing everything, that secrets are the price of safety. Sophie had been told by Garrett that her mother would be taken away if she talked, that Grandpa Roy would be angry, that the whole family would fall apart. He built a cage out of her love for us and locked her inside it. She told anyway. She told her teacher because she trusted Ms. Walsh, and she gave Ms. Walsh my phone number because she trusted me. I cried for the first time in years when I heard that. I mean really cried. The kind that comes from somewhere you didn't know you had. The legal process was long and there were days it felt like it was designed to outlast the truth. Garrett's attorneys filed motions to suppress the digital evidence, argued chain of custody issues, brought in an expert witness who tried to cast doubt on the forensic analysis. They questioned Sophie's credibility during pre-trial proceedings. They suggested she'd been coached. The judge was not impressed. The trial lasted 9 days. I attended every single one. I sat 3 rows back and watched the man who had adopted my granddaughter and used that trust as cover sit at the defense table with his careful face on. He was good at looking reasonable. He'd been practicing that look his whole life. On the 6th day of testimony, Sophie was brought in to testify via a closed-circuit setup so she didn't have to be in the same room as Garrett. She sat in a separate room with a victim advocate and answered questions projected on a screen to the courtroom. She was 8 years old by then. She wore a blue cardigan and her hair was in a ponytail. She answered every question clearly. When the defense attorney tried to rattle her, carefully, legally, but deliberately, she took a breath and said, "I'm telling the truth. I told the truth the whole time." The courtroom was very quiet after that. Renata was beside me. I felt her take my hand. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. Guilty on all counts, 2 counts of sexual exploitation of a minor, production of child sexual abuse material, aggravated sexual conduct with a minor. The judge sentenced Garrett Holloway to 60 years in prison without possibility of parole for the first 40. Given his age, he was 39. It was a sentence that would end in that building. Renata filed for divorce from her hospital bed. She'd been prescribed something to sleep during the worst of the trial, and the day the verdict came in, she didn't need it. Patricia, the prosecutor whose name I can't recall right this moment and doesn't matter, told us the sentence was among the highest the presiding judge had ever handed down for these charges. The judge had said from the bench, "You used the legal bond of adoption, a bond intended to protect a child, as a mechanism of access. There are no words in this court's vocabulary sufficient for what that represents." Renata was given full custody of Sophie 3 months after the verdict. I drove down to Phoenix the day she was allowed to bring Sophie home. We stood on the front step of the apartment Renata had rented. She'd sold the house in Scottsdale, couldn't set foot in it again, couldn't blame her. And Sophie came through the door of the CPS vehicle with her little backpack and looked at her mother like she was checking to confirm she was real. They held each other for a long time on that front step. I stood back and let them have it. Later that evening, after dinner, Sophie came and sat next to me on the couch. We watched part of a movie, nothing serious, one of those animated things she liked. During a slow part, she leaned against my arm. "Grandpa Roy?" "Yeah, sweetheart." "Are you still mad?" I looked down at her. "Mad?" "Garrett said you'd be mad at me if I told." I turned the TV off. I made sure she was looking at me. "Sophie, I am not mad at you. I have never been mad at you. I want you to hear me. Nothing that happened is your fault. Not one thing. Do you understand?" She thought about it the way she thought about everything, seriously, taking her time. "Ms. Walsh said the same thing," she said. "Ms. Walsh is a smart woman. She's my favorite teacher. She's my favorite teacher too, and I've never met her." Sophie smiled at that, small but real. The months that followed weren't easy. I'd be lying if I said they were. Sophie had nightmares, sometimes 2 or 3 nights in a row. She saw a trauma therapist named Dr. 2, Yolanda Ferris, twice a week in Phoenix, a woman with a calm, steady voice and an office full of art supplies and plants, which Sophie decided meant she could be trusted. Dr. Ferris told Renata that Sophie was showing remarkable resilience, that the protective relationships in her life, her mother, her teacher, me, had given her a foundation that made healing possible rather than just theoretically achievable. Renata started her own therapy. She went through a period of rage that I thought might consume her, and then a period of grief, and then something harder to name, a kind of determined reconstruction. She quit the pharmaceutical marketing job she'd had since before Sophie was born and enrolled in a graduate program in social work. She told me she needed to be useful in a direction that made sense to her now. I understood that. I moved down to Phoenix 8 months after the trial. I'd been making the drive so often that I was essentially living out of a suitcase anyway, and Renata and Sophie needed continuity more than I needed my house in Flagstaff. I bought a small place 12 minutes from their apartment. Sophie was thrilled, which was the only vote that mattered. For her 9th birthday, she asked for a telescope. She'd gotten interested in astronomy through a unit at school and couldn't stop talking about Jupiter's moons. I bought her the best one I could find within a reasonable budget and set it up in her bedroom window. She stayed up past her bedtime that first night and called me at 10:30 to tell me she'd found Saturn. "I found Saturn, Grandpa Roy." "You found Saturn. I can see the rings." I could hear the joy in her voice, this clean, uncomplicated joy. and I had to put my hand over my phone for a second so she wouldn't hear me. "That's incredible," I said when I could. "Tell me everything you see." About a year after Sophie came home, her therapist mentioned that Sophie had been asking about writing something down. Not a diary, she'd said, but something she wanted other kids to read. Dr. Ferris thought it was a healthy impulse and suggested Renata and I support it. What Sophie wrote, with a little help from Dr. Ferris and Renata on the phrasing, was a short letter. It was eventually shared with the advocacy center that had conducted her forensic interview, and they've used it since in their work with families. Sophie was 8 when she wrote it, 9 when it was shared. It said, "I was scared to tell for a long time. I thought nobody would believe me and that everybody I loved would go away. But my teacher believed me and my grandpa came, and things were really hard for a while, but they got better. If something bad is happening to you, please tell someone safe. A teacher, a grandpa, a neighbor. Keep telling until someone helps. It's not your fault. You don't have to be scared forever." I wasn't. The advocacy center director told me that in the 6 months after they began sharing Sophie's letter in their family education programs, 4 children disclosed abuse that had previously gone unreported. 4 children. I think about that number a lot. Garrett Holloway is in a federal correctional facility in Arizona. He will be in his late 70s before he's eligible for any parole review, and given the nature of his crimes, that review is a formality with a predictable outcome. I don't think about him often. He's not worth the space. What I do think about, what I think about all the time actually, is that 4th of July, Sophie's hand in mine. Do I have to go? I told myself I was reading too much into it. I've had to make peace with the fact that I was wrong about that, and then making peace with it doesn't mean the guilt goes away entirely. Paris, who I've spoken to myself a handful of times at Renata's urging, says that the psychological architecture of this kind of abuse is specifically designed to prevent recognition, that the abuser counts on the instinct to normalize, to reassure yourself, to not disrupt family peace over a feeling you can't name. She's right. That doesn't make the 4th of July easier. But then I think about the phone call from Ms. Walsh. I think about driving down I-17 at 80 miles an hour, with my heart in my throat. I think about Sophie on that front step with her backpack, checking that her mother was real. I think about I found Saturn, Grandpa Roy. Here's what I want anyone reading this to understand, because if you've stayed with this story this long, you deserve the honest part. If a child's behavior changes, pay attention. If they become quieter around a specific person or place, pay attention. If they ask if they have to go somewhere, sit down and talk to them. Children don't have the vocabulary for what adults do to them. They find oblique ways to reach you. Garrett has a room. That was Sophie, at 7 years old, using the only words she had. Believe children. The research on false disclosures and child abuse cases is unambiguous. Children do not fabricate this kind of information. When a child tells you something is wrong, the question is never, "Is this true?" The question is, "What do I do next?" Report to the police. Report to Child Protective Services. In Arizona, as in most states, you don't need proof before you call. You need a reasonable concern. Let the professionals determine what comes next. That is their job. Your job is to make the call. And if you're a survivor reading this, if you're 60 years old and you've carried something since you were 7, something you never told, something you buried deep enough that you thought it couldn't reach you anymore, I want you to know that what happened to you mattered, that there's no expiration on deciding to tell someone, that therapy is not weakness and healing is not a deadline. Sophie is doing well. She's in 4th grade. She's obsessed with planets and also, currently, with a specific YouTube channel that teaches you how to draw animals in a cartoon style, which means my refrigerator is covered with felt-tip drawings of cartoon foxes and cartoon penguins and one cartoon axolotl that honestly looks a little alarming. I put them all up. Last month, she showed me a drawing she'd made at school, an art class project about family. It was a crayon portrait. A small figure with a ponytail holding hands with a tall figure with gray hair. Above it she'd written, in careful second-grader print, "Me and Grandpa Roy. He came when I needed him." I still have it. It's on my desk, next to a photo of Carol. I don't know if I did enough soon enough. I'll probably never fully stop asking that question. But I know that when it mattered, I drove south. And Sophie found Saturn. That's enough. That has to be enough. I keep thinking about the drive down I-17 that August morning. 80 miles an hour. Coffee still on my kitchen table. The newspaper open to a page I never finished reading. I didn't know exactly what I was driving toward. I just knew I couldn't sit still. That's what I want to say first. Action is a choice. It sounds obvious until you're the person standing at the moment when action cost something real. Your family's peace, your son-in-law's reputation, the version of your life where everything was complicated but manageable. I had every reason to wait, to call Renata again, to tell myself that a 7-year-old's no to a teacher wasn't enough to blow up a marriage. People rationalize inaction all the time, and they're not bad people. They're scared people. I was scared too. I drove anyway. What I'd come to understand about that morning is that doing right by Sophie didn't require certainty. It required the willingness to be wrong and do it anyway. That's the part nobody tells you, that moral clarity isn't the same as confidence. I wasn't confident. I was terrified, but somewhere underneath the fear there was a line I knew I couldn't uncross, and Sophie's face at the end of my driveway on the 4th of July was on the wrong side of it. Renata used to say she felt stupid for not seeing it sooner. I spent a lot of time pushing back on that. What Garrett did, the way he built his access, his cover, his explanations, that was deliberate architecture. It took intelligence to construct, and it took intelligence to dismantle. Ms. Walsh had 19 years of experience reading children, and she still called me instead of moving immediately, because she understood that doing this right mattered as much as doing it fast. The investigation, the forensic interviews, the careful legal work, all of it required clear thinking under pressure. The people who helped Sophie weren't just good-hearted, they were skilled. They brought their whole minds to it. And Sophie, God. Sophie at 8 years old in that closed-circuit room, answering every question in her small, clear voice. When the defense attorney tried to shake her, she took a breath and said she was telling the truth. That kind of steadiness in a child who had every reason to collapse. I don't have a clean explanation for it. I think some of it was Dr. Ferris, some of it was Ms. Walsh, some of it was Renata, who showed up for her daughter through her own wreckage every single day, and some of it was just Sophie, who turned out to have more in her than anyone had asked her to show before. The crayon drawing on my desk, me and Grandpa Roy. He came when I needed him. I look at it on hard days, not because it makes me feel like I did enough. I'm not sure I'll ever fully stop turning over that 4th of July, standing at the end of the driveway, letting the car pull away. But I look at it because it's true. I came. That part is true. If I learned anything from all of this, it's that the 3 things that actually change outcomes aren't complicated, but they're hard to hold at the same time. Doing right when it's costly. Thinking clearly when everything in you wants to fall apart, and staying in it, for Sophie, for Renata, for the long months of therapy appointments and nightmares and cartoon axolotl drawings on my refrigerator, when there was no dramatic moment left, just the daily work of being there. Sophie found Saturn. That's what I think about when I need to remember that it was worth it.